4 artificial islands sit off the southern tip of Malaysia, covered in glass towers, empty shopping malls, and freshly paved roads that lead nowhere. This is Forest City. It was designed for 700,000 residents. Current estimates put actual occupancy at roughly 1%. Somewhere between $100 billion in planned investment and the reality of what stands here today, something went catastrophically wrong. Not a hurricane, not an earthquake, not a single engineering failure. Forest City is a $100 billion ghost town, and the reasons it's being abandoned are far stranger than anything that could go wrong with steel and concrete. To understand how we got here, rewind to 2006. A Chinese property giant called Country Garden had an idea so audacious it made seasoned developers nervous. They wanted to build a city from scratch. Not a housing development, not a resort, a fully functioning metropolis on land that didn't exist yet, off the coast of Johor Bahru, just across the strait from Singapore. The pitch was irresistible. Proximity to one of Asia's wealthiest city-states. A special economic zone with tax incentives. International schools, waterfront living, lush green architecture. Country Garden's chairman, Yang Guotiang, personally championed the vision. Forest City would be a model for 21st century urban living. Clean, modern, tech-forward. 4 man-made islands totaling 30 square kilometers. A price tag that would eventually swell past $100 billion. And a target audience that made the entire gamble possible. Mainland Chinese buyers looking to park wealth overseas. Before a single tower could rise, engineers had to solve a problem. That doesn't exist for most cities. They had to build the ground itself. The reclamation process was enormous. Millions of cubic meters of sand were dredged from the seabed and deposited in carefully engineered layers. Geotechnical teams reinforced the artificial land with prefabricated vertical drains to accelerate soil consolidation, essentially squeezing water out of the new ground so it could bear the weight of skyscrapers. Environmental impact assessments flagged concerns about seagrass beds and local fisheries, but construction pushed forward. The engineering was, by most accounts, sound. Sophisticated coastal barriers protected the islands from erosion. Infrastructure, roads, sewage, electrical grids, fiber optic networks was installed to handle a population that hadn't arrived yet. The scale was staggering. At peak construction, Forest City was one of the largest active building sites in Southeast Asia. For a few intoxicating years, Forest City sold like nothing the real estate world had ever seen. Country Garden deployed thousands of sales agents across China. They chartered buses to bring prospective buyers directly to showrooms. Marketing videos promised a tropical paradise minutes from Singapore, with apartments starting at prices well below what buyers would pay in Shanghai or Beijing. Between 2014 and 2018, units moved fast, overwhelmingly to Chinese nationals. At one point, roughly 80% of all buyers were from mainland China. Country Garden reported billions in sales revenue. Towers went up at breakneck speed. The dream seemed unstoppable. Then Malaysia's 2018 election changed everything overnight. Mahathir Mohamad, the newly elected Prime Minister, made Forest City a political target almost immediately. He publicly stated that foreigners who purchased units would not be granted visas to live in Malaysia. The statement sent shockwaves through the project. Overnight, the primary selling point, buy property, gain a foothold in Southeast Asia, evaporated for Chinese investors. But Mahathir's remarks were only the first blow. Back in China, Beijing was simultaneously tightening capital controls, cracking down on money flowing out of the country and into foreign real estate. The two forces collided with devastating precision. Chinese buyers couldn't easily move money out. And even if they could, Malaysia just told them they weren't welcome. Sales didn't slow down. They collapsed. Drive through Forest City today, and the silence is the first thing that hits you. Rows of residential towers, 30 and 40 stories tall, stand with darkened windows. A massive shopping mall echoes with the footsteps of a handful of visitors. Manicured gardens are maintained by crews that outnumber the residents who use them. According to reporting by Reuters and the South China Morning Post, occupancy rates have hovered in the low single digits. Some blocks are virtually empty. Residents who did move in describe an eerie experience, living in a beautiful apartment surrounded by hundreds of uninhabited units. Restaurants close for lack of customers. Shuttle buses run nearly empty. Amenities built for tens of thousands serve dozens. The infrastructure works perfectly. The water runs. The elevators operate. The roads are smooth. But a city without people isn't a city. It's a monument. Here's what makes Forest City so painful to study. The engineering itself was never the problem. The land reclamation held. The buildings met spec. The infrastructure functions as designed. Every system the engineers delivered works. The failure happened in the space between engineering and reality, in the assumptions about who would come and why they'd stay. Forest City was designed for a buyer who no longer exists, a Chinese investor looking for an overseas asset in a politically welcoming environment with easy capital transfer. When those conditions vanished, the engineering became irrelevant. You can build the most sophisticated water treatment plant in Southeast Asia, and Forest City arguably did. But if no one turns on a faucet, the plant is just expensive sculpture. This is the paradox at the heart of megacity projects. You can engineer every physical system to perfection. You cannot engineer demand. By 2023, the developer behind Forest City was drowning. Country Garden, once China's largest private property developer, began missing bond payments. The company's financial crisis mirrored the broader collapse of China's real estate sector, a domino chain that toppled giants like Evergrande before it. Country Garden's total liabilities exceeded $200 billion. Forest City, already a symbol of overreach, became a symbol of an entire industry in free fall. Construction on later phases slowed to a crawl. Planned facilities remained unbuilt. The grand vision of a completed city by the 2030s began to look less like an ambitious timeline and more like a fantasy. Workers were laid off. Marketing budgets evaporated. The showrooms that once bustled with buyers from Guangzhou and Shenzhen went quiet. Stand on the waterfront promenade of Forest City, and you can count the lit windows in a 40-story tower on one hand. The numbers tell a brutal story. Approximately 9,000 acres of reclaimed land, tens of thousands of completed residential units, commercial space designed for businesses that never arrived, hotels built for tourists who chose Singapore instead, just 2 kilometers away, but a world apart in terms of appeal. Some estimates suggest that less than 10% of completed units have ever been occupied for any sustained period. The exact figures are hard to pin down. Country Garden hasn't been forthcoming with detailed occupancy data, but every independent report paints the same picture. The city is, for all practical purposes, empty. $100 billion. Bought pristine roads, functioning utilities, gleaming towers, and almost no one to use any of it. Malaysia hasn't given up on Forest City entirely. In 2022, the government designated it as a special financial zone, offering new tax breaks and incentives to lure businesses and residents. The strategy shifted away from Chinese buyers and toward multinational companies, digital nomads, and regional investors. There have been small signs of life. A data center project, some interest from logistics firms, a handful of new commercial tenants. Malaysian officials point to the zone's proximity to Singapore and its existing infrastructure as competitive advantages. And they're not wrong. The bones of Forest City are solid. The question is whether rebranding and incentives can accomplish what $100 billion in construction could not. Give people a reason to actually live here. Some analysts are cautiously optimistic, arguing that the infrastructure is a sunk cost that could eventually attract value. Others call it a slow-motion write-off. The honest answer is that nobody knows yet. Forest City was supposed to prove that if you build big enough, people will come. That if you engineer every detail, from the seawall to the fiber optic cables, demand will follow supply. It proved the opposite. The most expensive lesson in modern urban development. It is sitting right there on 4 artificial islands in the Strait of Johor. You can manufacture land, but you cannot manufacture a community. Politics shift. Capital flows reverse. Markets that seemed permanent turn out to be momentary. And when they do, all the engineering excellence in the world can't fill an empty building. 50 years from now, Forest City will either be a thriving metropolis that took decades to find its footing, or the largest monument to misplaced confidence ever constructed. If stories like this one remind you why engineering is never just about engineering, consider subscribing. We break down the world's most ambitious projects every week. The ones that succeed, the ones that fail, and the ones still hanging in the balance. What happens next in Johor could redefine what we think we know about building cities from nothing.